Hey, what's going on everyone? Greg here, and the new 2018 Retina MacBook Air really did surprise me as soon as I took it out of the box. I'm really surprised with how much this just felt like a updated version of the MacBook Air. I really thought it was going to feel more like the 13-inch MacBook Pro. And when they redesigned this thing, I thought that if they ever did a update to the MacBook Air, it would just be the MacBook Pro Escape with the MacBook Air brand name on it. I didn't think they would do any changes to the design of the body, but they actually did change its body quite a bit. They made a tapered edge all the way going down the MacBook Air. Because it has that tapered edge at the bottom, it's really easy to just pick this thing up right by the front and just take it with you. Just very simple to grab and go in a way that a 13-inch MacBook Pro just isn't. Aside from this being a thin machine, Apple has done a lot to reduce the overall volume of this machine as well. They shrunk the bezels on the top of the screen. If you look at the old MacBook Air, if you look at those silver bezels, they are just really giant compared to the bezels on this. Now, this MacBook Air weighs 2.75 pounds. It's about 0.25 pounds lighter than the 13-inch MacBook Pro. That 2.5 pounds doesn't sound like a lot, but again, the way it's designed with that tapered edge, the way it thins out along the side, just makes this thing a lot easier to hold, a lot easier to carry around with you if you're carrying it around the house, browsing the web, holding it with one hand, typing with the other. This is something I've been doing with the Retina MacBook Air that I haven't been doing on a 13-inch MacBook Pro or even the 15-inch MacBook Pro, which would be a lot harder to handle this way. Now, you do lose all the legacy ports found on the older MacBook Air, so you're losing MagSafe, you're losing USB-A connection, and you're losing that SD card slot. In its place, you're getting two Thunderbolt 3 ports, and that is for charging and as well for any accessories. Now, if you've watched any of my other MacBook Pro videos, you know my opinions on the Thunderbolt 3 port. I'm actually quite a fan of it, whereas other people are quite critical of the USB-C Thunderbolt 3 port. I really like how versatile this port is. I like that it gives you up to 40 gigabits of bandwidth in them. You can drive external GPUs with them. You can drive 5K monitors like the one behind me. And if you really want all of those legacy ports back, if you really want your old ports back, the versatile of Thunderbolt 3 USB-C means you just need one adapter. And with just one adapter, you'll get even more ports than the original MacBook Air had. Now, this is the base model of this MacBook Air. And what's strange about this MacBook Air as opposed to other Macs is it only has one processor speed at 1.6 gigahertz, and that can turbo boost all the way up to 3.6 gigahertz. So at least they made the processor option of buying this easy for you because you only get one choice. This model also has 8 gigabytes of RAM, which has been handling pretty well through all my day-to-day tasks. And this is the 128 gigabyte storage model, which is a little bit anemic. I do wish that I went for a 256 gigabyte storage option because for me, I do carry around a lot of video files, and when I'm editing on the MacBook Air, I have to definitely put an external drive on it, which is a shame because this thing does have really fast solid-state drive speeds. I would only recommend this if you're using a lot of cloud storage, you're doing a lot of streaming, you're just browsing the web, you don't plan on doing any photo, video editing, or installing a lot of apps that take up a lot of gigabytes, like some games. So let's go ahead and talk about this display. I mean, this update to the Retina MacBook Air, the most important thing about it is that Retina screen. Everyone wanted a Retina screen in a MacBook Air for the longest time. So this is a 13.3-inch screen, has a resolution of 2560 by 1600, and of course it has that Retina resolution of 227 pixels per inch. Now you might be thinking to yourself, okay, this is the same exact display that's found on the 13-inch MacBook Pro, and you'd be wrong. This display is actually a little bit worse than the one found on the 13-inch MacBook Pros in a couple of ways. So it doesn't have True Tone, which is a new feature on the 2018 version of the MacBook Pro. It's also lacking that wide color P3 gamut support, but if you already have a MacBook Pro, you're probably not coming to this display. The colors on this are definitely nice. They're not bad in any way, but I do notice the lack of that P3 wide color support. If you're not used to wide color support, you might not notice that it's missing, but I certainly am because all of my other Apple products do have the P3 wide color support, like my iMac, my iPad Pro, my MacBook Pro, and even my iPhone. It's also not as bright as the current MacBook Pros, which I believe get up to 500 nits of brightness. This thing gets around 300 nits of brightness. It hasn't really been too much of a problem for me. I know I've heard other people complain that this only gets to 300 nits of brightness. I've noticed that I've had the brightness setting higher than I might have on my other previous MacBook Pros, but I didn't ever think to myself, hey, this screen is really dim, it needs more brightness. So far, it's been fine in my day-to-day use. And if you're coming from that old MacBook Air, the screen is just night and day. It's not even a fair comparison, and it shouldn't be a fair comparison. The way Apple let that old 13-inch MacBook Air stick around for so long without updating that horrible TFT panel screen, it really started to show its age, even in 2016, and now we're all the way in 2018, and Apple still sells that same MacBook Air. I wouldn't recommend buying that at all. Another thing that's really improved from the last MacBook Air are the speakers inside of this thing. So Apple has gotten really good with its speaker design lately on everything from iPhones, iPads, and of course the MacBook Pros. And they did an astonishing job with the MacBook Air speakers. When I first turned on the MacBook Air, one of the first things I did was watch a video, and I immediately thought, wow, these speakers are loud and clear. They sound really good. Another new change with the MacBook Air is that new 3rd generation butterfly keyboard. Now, I'm a fan of the more shallower key travel on the new MacBook Pros and of course this new MacBook Air. I know a lot of people who aren't a fan of these more shallow keys. And to me, those old MacBook Air keys just feel really mushy by comparison. One of the most popular use cases for the old MacBook Air was writing on it. It was a great machine because it was so light, so thin, just to carry it around with you anywhere. And I'm sure you've seen young, aspiring writers or bloggers at a Starbucks on their MacBook Air, and I think this MacBook Air is a perfect use case for someone who is going to do a lot of writing on it, especially if you like that new keyboard. It's just so thin, so light, and you can just carry it around with you, plop it down on a table, and just get to writing. And that new keyboard is definitely an improvement for me. Now, what's more interesting about this new Retina MacBook Air is the inclusion of the Touch ID sensor in the top right of the keyboard. This is the first MacBook to have Touch ID independent of the touch bar. So far, Touch ID on this thing works really well. Really great to log in fast and to use it in third-party apps. The trackpad on the new MacBook Air is also bigger than the older MacBook Air. It's a Force Touch trackpad, but still smaller than the trackpads found on the MacBook Pro, but overall just a really good trackpad. Alright, so if you're watching this, you're probably wondering the most about performance on this MacBook Air. We all know that the initial controversy was that it had an Intel Core Y processor, and a lot of people were worried that it wouldn't be powerful enough to drive this computer for people who want to do a bunch of different tasks. People who aren't necessarily pros, but still want to have a capable machine where they're doing web browsing, maybe some light photo editing, maybe some light video editing, and just something light that they can carry around with them, but is still capable enough to handle some lighter prosumer tasks. Now, the thing about this processor, from what I understand, is that it is a 7-watt Y processor, which is different. They're usually 5 watts, and that this has a fan to cool the processor, so as it turbo boosts up to those 3.6 gigahertz speeds, it can maintain those speeds. Now, this is only a dual-core processor, and the new 2018 MacBook Pros are now standard with 4-core processors, and the 15-inch version of that MacBook Pro gets a 6-core processor. So this Retina MacBook Air is definitely slower than that newest generation of the 2018 MacBook Pro with Touch Bar and the 15-inch MacBook Pro with Touch Bar. But don't let that Core Y processor fool you. But again, this machine isn't geared towards pros, it's geared towards people who want to use it as an everyday laptop, and it's great for those everyday tasks like web browsing, watching video, listening to music, answering emails, looking at photos. Really handles it well. There's no slowdown with that Core Y processor. And although this thing isn't going to get you the fastest render times, if you're running optimized software like Final Cut Pro, this thing can handle it. I was editing video on the MacBook Air, and sure, the render times were longer than my iMac or my MacBook Pro, but this thing could certainly handle video editing. And if you're only doing 1080p video editing, it's gonna handle that a little bit better. I was also able to edit photos in an app like Affinity Photos, and it did a pretty good job of handling that well. I wouldn't be putting a bunch of batch processing and doing a bunch of raw photos at the same time. That might be a little bit slow on it, but if you're doing a single photo or 2 photos at a time, this thing can certainly handle it. I also like to do a little bit of light gaming. I don't know if you noticed, but I did fire up StarCraft 2 on this, and it could run at the lowest settings, and I could probably bump it up to medium settings as well if I was willing to sacrifice frame rate. But playing StarCraft 2, I was able to get 90 frames per second on low settings. It's not going to blow you away, but if you're going to do some light gaming, this thing's capable of doing that too. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, that's great, fine, it can handle some of those apps, and, you know, it's going to be a little bit slower than the MacBook Pro. Why why didn't they just throw that quad-core MacBook Pro processor into this MacBook Air? That would make it the ultimate laptop for you, right? Well, here's where I really like the MacBook Air. The battery life on this Retina MacBook Air is a lot better than the 13-inch MacBook Pro. I was able to get around 9 to 12 hours on this MacBook Air using it day to day. Another benefit to this thing is it doesn't really get hot when you're using it on your lap. And if you watch my MacBook Pro review, the 13-inch MacBook Pro, you know I complained about the heat in that MacBook Pro. This thing stays cool to the touch as it's on your lap. And that's why this MacBook Air surprised me so much. I wasn't expecting to like it as much as I did. I definitely wasn't expecting to like using it more than I liked using the 13-inch MacBook Pro, which on paper is much more powerful than the Retina MacBook Air. And that really leads me to my conclusion with the 13-inch Retina MacBook Air, that it's more than just the raw paper specs. It's more about the experience of using this product. It's more than just the specs. This thing is much more fun to use than the 13-inch MacBook Pro. I love carrying it around with me. I love browsing the web while I'm sitting on the couch watching a YouTube video. Light tasks like that are really a joy to use on this MacBook Air. And it's so much more easier to carry around with me, throw in a bag, that I've been picking it up more than my MacBook Pro recently. Now don't get me wrong, the MacBook Pro is a great laptop and I really like it. And if you are a pro, I wouldn't recommend picking the MacBook Air as your daily laptop to get your pro tasks done. But if you're an average consumer, if you just want a really good, light, reliable laptop that can handle some basic tasks like web browsing, watching video, and again, even some lighter pro tasks like editing one photo at a time, editing some 1080p video, or even 4K video if you're using Final Cut Pro. So if that sounds like you, if someone who has a lighter workload, if you're a student who has to carry this thing around with you, you're going to be taking a bunch of notes, if you're going to business meetings, you want something thin, light, and still a little bit more capable than that 12-inch MacBook, and you love Mac OS, this is a really good laptop. Okay everyone, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, make sure you give me a like. If you want to see more from my channel, including maybe some more content on this MacBook Air, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you think of the Retina MacBook Air in the comments below. Do you plan on picking one up? Are you more of a MacBook Pro user? And thanks for hanging around with me. Thanks for sticking around for this video. Thanks for hearing my opinions. I will see you guys in the next video. Take care everyone.